Her wrists were raw and bleeding where the chains cut into her skin. The smell of mildew, sweat, and blood filled the dark basement. Somewhere above, she could hear his boots thumping slowly across the wooden floor. For the first time in 4 months, she thought she might be leaving this place, but not alive. A metallic clink echoed as he unlocked the padlock. The door creaked open, letting in a sliver of daylight that stabbed her eyes. "It's time, Marcy." His voice rasped, calm in a way that was far more terrifying than yelling. In his right hand, he held the same heavy wrench she'd seen him use on broken pipes. Her heart slammed against her chest. She tried to pull away, but the chain rattled. Too short, too tight. He stepped closer, raising the wrench. She knew this was the end. Before the blow came, a loud knock rattled the front door upstairs. He froze. "Police?" a voice shouted. His eyes went wide, not with fear, but with rage. Marcy Lynn Dalton's life had been quiet for years. After her divorce from Greg Sanders, she'd sworn off serious relationships. Everyone in the small Arizona town of Pine, Mason knew why. Greg had a reputation. He was charming in public. But in private, he was a man who'd broken her jaw once during an argument and left her with bruises she'd had to hide under long sleeves in the middle of summer. She had finally gotten away from him a decade ago, moved into a small one-story house she bought with her savings, and built a modest life. She worked as a cashier at the grocery store, took care of her aging father, and tended to her little garden. People in town admired her strength for leaving him. So when Greg showed up at her door one warm April afternoon, no one would have guessed what would happen next. He looked different. His hair was longer and streaked with gray, and he wore a plain white shirt with a cross pendant hanging from his neck. He told her he'd found God while doing a ministry program in another state. He said he wanted to make amends. Marcy didn't believe him at first. "Greg, you nearly ruined me," she said flatly, holding the door but not opening it all the way. "I know," he said, his voice low, eyes glistening like he'd been crying. "I was sick back then. I'm not that man anymore. I've been clean for 3 years. I just need a place to stay until I get on my feet." She should have said no. She knew she should have said no. But something in his tone, or maybe the years of wanting to believe people could change, made her hesitate. And in that hesitation, her life started sliding toward the nightmare. The first week, Greg was polite. He cooked breakfast, went for morning walks, and even offered to help with repairs around the house. Marcy's friends were skeptical, but they saw her smile for the first time in months. The change came slowly. It started with little things. Greg asking where she was going, telling her she shouldn't talk to certain neighbors. Then he accidentally locked her in her own bedroom one night while he was fixing the door. By the 3rd month, she wasn't allowed to leave the house without him. And by the 4th month, she wasn't allowed to leave the basement at all. It had been a sunny afternoon when he shoved her down those creaky wooden steps, the air turning damp and cold around her. She had screamed, but the walls were thick, and the nearest neighbor was too far away to hear. The last thing she saw before the padlock snapped shut was Greg's face. Not the smiling, apologetic man who'd knocked on her door, but the same cold, cruel expression she had known years ago. Now, in the dark, she counted time by the meals he brought her and the sound of his truck leaving the driveway. She knew she had to find a way out, but with each passing day, her body grew weaker. One night, she heard something outside the basement window, footsteps crunching on gravel. She pressed her ear to the cold stone wall, straining to hear. Then came the faintest sound, just enough to make her freeze. Someone was calling her name. And that's when she realized it wasn't Greg. Deputy Sheriff Laura Mendez had been with the Coconino County Sheriff's Office for 12 years. She'd seen enough domestic calls to know that the most dangerous time for a woman was when she thought the violence was over. On a hot August morning, the call came in from a worried neighbor. Yeah, I live next door to Marcy Dalton. I haven't seen her in weeks. Her ex-husband's truck's been in the driveway, but she won't answer the door. Something's not right. Laura drove out to Pine Mesa with her partner, Deputy Tim Keller. The air shimmered with heat waves rising off the asphalt, the kind of Arizona heat that made metal too hot to touch. Greg answered the door with a tight smile. He looked sweaty and jittery, claiming Marcy had gone to visit a cousin in Phoenix. When did she leave? Laura asked, her eyes scanning past him into the house. Couple weeks ago, Greg replied, scratching the back of his neck. Mind if we take a look around? Tim asked. Greg's smile faltered. Is that really necessary? I mean, she's fine. She calls me all the time. Laura caught the way his eyes darted toward the hallway, the kind of look people gave when they were hiding something. Sir, she said firmly, we need to verify her well-being. Greg sighed, stepped aside, and let them in. The air inside was cooler, but smelled faintly of bleach, like someone had cleaned too much, too quickly. Laura noticed the basement door had a new, shiny padlock on it. What's this for? She asked casually. Oh, that's storage. I've been keeping tools and valuables down there, Greg said, but his voice was too quick, too rehearsed. Tim asked for the key. Greg hesitated, then muttered that he'd misplaced it. That was enough for Laura. Tim, call it in. We need a warrant. Greg's jaw tightened. You can't just... Laura cut him off. We can and we will. The next 2 hours were tense. Greg paced while Laura and Tim waited outside for the warrant, the late summer sun beating down on them. A few neighbors gathered at a distance, whispering. When the warrant finally came through, Laura's gut told her they weren't going to find a simple storage room. Tim cut the padlock, and the basement door creaked open. The first thing they noticed was the smell, damp, moldy, and something else, something metallic. Laura shined her flashlight down the steps. At the far end of the basement, in the shadows, something moved. Marcy, she called softly. A faint clink of chains answered her. Then, from the darkness, a voice cracked and hoarse whispered, "Help me." Laura's heart slammed against her ribs. She started down the stairs, but halfway down, a floorboard groaned above them. Greg hadn't stayed outside, and in his hand was a gun. Laura froze halfway down the steps, her flashlight beam trembling against the basement wall. Tim was still at the doorway, but Greg now stood in the hall above them, both hands gripping a black pistol. His face was flushed and shiny with sweat. "Step away from her," Greg barked, his voice trembling with fury. "Greg," Laura said calmly, keeping her eyes on his hands. "Put the gun down. You don't want to make this worse for yourself." "She doesn't need your help," he snapped. "She's mine. Always has been." Behind Laura, Marcy whimpered softly. The sound seemed to agitate Greg more. He took a step forward, his boots thudding on the wooden floor. Tim's hand was already hovering near his holster. "Greg, I'm telling you, drop it." For a moment, it looked like Greg might do it. His arm wavered, but then his expression hardened, and Laura saw something terrifying in his eyes. The certainty of a man who had already decided what he was going to do. Laura acted on instinct. She lunged sideways into the shadows of the basement wall, just as Greg fired. The gunshot cracked like lightning, deafening in the enclosed space. Wood splintered from the doorframe above Tim's head. Tim drew and fired once, a warning shot into the floorboards near Greg's boots. Greg stumbled backward, cursing, but didn't drop the gun. Instead, he bolted toward the back door. "Go! I've got her!" Laura shouted at Tim, who took off after Greg. Laura scrambled down the remaining steps to Marcy. The sight nearly made her stop in her tracks. Marcy was shackled to a steel pipe, her arms raw from the cuffs. She was thin, far too thin, her cheekbones sharp, lips cracked. Laura dropped to her knees. "It's okay, Marcy. You're safe now." "No," Marcy whispered urgently. "He's not going to stop. He told me he'll never let me go." Outside, Tim's shouts echoed, then faded. A few seconds later, the sound of a truck engine roared to life, tires screeching across gravel. Greg had escaped. By the time backup arrived, Greg was gone. Patrol cars swept the back roads. Helicopters scanned the desert edges, but there was no sign of him. He'd taken his gun, a backpack, and, according to one neighbor, had been stashing supplies in his truck for weeks. At the hospital, Marcy told Laura pieces of her ordeal between sips of water. She'd been chained in the basement for 4 months. Greg had taken her phone, her wallet, everything. He only fed her once a day, sometimes skipping days if he thought she'd misbehaved. She described moments when he would sit on the basement steps and just watch her, saying nothing for hours, and how sometimes she'd wake up to find him standing over her in the dark. He said finding God was the only way I'd open the door for him, Marcy murmured. And he was right. Tears streaked her hollow cheeks. I hate that I believed him. Laura felt the heaviness of the case settling over her. Greg wasn't just abusive. He was methodical. He'd planned this. And now he was somewhere out there, armed, desperate, and very aware that law enforcement was hunting him. 2 days later, just as Laura's team began mapping out the search grid, they got word from another county. A farmer, 50 miles south, had reported a stranger camping near his property, a man with a truck that matched Greg's. Laura's heart kicked up. They might have just found their first real lead. But when the deputies arrived at the farm, the truck was there, empty, and in the dirt near the barn, they found something that made Laura's stomach knot. A set of fresh footprints, leading toward the tree line, and right beside them, another set, smaller. The sun was dipping low when Laura and Tim stood over the 2 sets of footprints. The desert light made every shadow sharp, every sound louder than it was. The smaller prints were bare, the toes splayed in the dirt. Laura crouched and traced one lightly with her gloved finger. "These aren't old," she murmured. "Whoever this is, they've been walking with him recently." Tim's jaw clenched. Could be a hostage or an accomplice. Laura replied grimly. They followed the trail into the tree line, the dry branches snapping under their boots. The air smelled faintly of campfire smoke. They found a small clearing with a makeshift lean-to made of tarp and rope. Inside were 2 bedrolls, a few half-empty cans of beans, and a plastic jug of water. Laura noticed something odd, a torn piece of floral fabric caught on one of the ropes. It was light pink, patterned with faded roses. It didn't look like something Greg would own. Just then, a crack of twigs to their right made them spin. Tim raised his flashlight, cutting a beam through the trees. A young woman stood about 30 feet away, her hair tangled, eyes wide. She looked to be in her 20s, but her clothes were filthy, and her bare feet were caked in dirt. "It's okay," Laura called gently, keeping her hands where the woman could see them. "We're with the sheriff's department." The woman took one shaky step forward, then froze. Her gaze darted past them, deeper into the woods. Laura's stomach dropped. She turned just in time to see a shadow moving fast between the trees. "Greg!" Tim shouted, taking off after him. Laura stayed with the woman, who was trembling and breathing hard. "What's your name?" The woman's lips trembled. "Sadie," she stammered. He said he'd kill me if I ran." Laura felt the cold wave of realization hit her. Greg had another victim. "Sadie, is anyone else with him?" Laura asked urgently. Sadie's eyes filled with tears. "No, just me. But he's not going to let you take him. He told me. If he saw cops coming again, he'd make sure no one left alive." An hour later, they had Sadie in the back of a cruiser, wrapped in a blanket. She confirmed she'd met Greg weeks earlier at a roadside diner while hitchhiking. He'd offered food and shelter. She'd been with him ever since, too scared to try and escape. Laura couldn't shake the thought. Greg wasn't just running. He was collecting women. When they regrouped with search teams, Tim came back empty-handed. Greg knew the terrain better than anyone, and darkness had closed in fast. By the time the command post packed up for the night, the desert had fallen silent, except for the wind. Laura climbed into her vehicle, exhaustion pressing on her shoulders. She was about to start the engine when her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "You think you can stop me? You don't know what's coming." There was no signature, no location. Just one more thing to confirm what Laura already feared. Greg wasn't just hiding. He was watching them. Laura stared at the glowing screen, the text message burning into her mind. Her first thought was to trace the number, but the tech team's quick check revealed it had come from a prepaid burner phone, untraceable without a lucky break. It wasn't just a threat. It was a challenge. The next morning, she called a meeting at the sheriff's office. Maps of Coconino County were spread across the conference table, dotted with colored pins marking sightings, search areas, and reported break-ins. Greg had been taking supplies from isolated sheds and cabins, enough to keep himself alive off the grid. "Every time we get close, he's already gone," Tim said, rubbing his temples. Laura studied the map. Something bothered her. The sightings weren't random. They formed a wide, crescent-shaped loop across the county. She traced the arc with her finger. "He's circling," she said slowly. "And if this pattern holds," she tapped a spot on the map, "he's heading back toward Pine Mesa." Tim frowned. Why would he go back to where it all started? Laura's gut tightened. Because he left something unfinished. That afternoon, they brought Marcy in under protective custody. She'd been recovering in a safe house, but the news made her pale. "He's coming back for me, isn't he?" she asked quietly. Laura hesitated only a second. "We think it's possible." Marcy's hands twisted in her lap. "You don't understand. He doesn't just get mad. He needs control. If he thinks you took me from him, he'll stop at nothing." It was then that Marcy mentioned something she hadn't told him before. Greg had an old hunting cabin deep in the Kaibab National Forest. It wasn't his name. It belonged to a cousin who died years ago, but Greg knew every inch of it. He'd once told Marcy it was a perfect place to disappear. Laura's heart leapt. This was the break they needed. The next morning, a tactical team moved in on the cabin. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, the forest floor littered with needles. As they approached, Laura could see thin smoke curling from the chimney. Inside, the place looked lived in. A cot, a wood stove, and piles of canned food. But Greg wasn't there. What they did find stopped Laura cold. A collection of women's belongings spread across a wooden table. A hairbrush, a necklace, and a worn leather wallet. Inside the wallet was a driver's license. Not Marcy's. The name read Amberly Hollis. Tim looked at Laura. Another victim? Laura felt the blood drain from her face. She'd seen that name before, on a missing persons flyer from 3 years ago. Greg hadn't just taken Marcy and Sadie. He'd been doing this for a long time. And somewhere in these woods, Laura realized there might be more than just the women they knew about. She was about to call it in when a sharp crack echoed from the trees outside. It wasn't a gunshot. It was the sound of a branch snapping under heavy boots. Laura's eyes met Tim's. Greg was close, and now he knew they'd found his trophies. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Laura gripped her radio, signaling for the team to stay alert. Tim moved toward the cabin door, scanning the tree line. Another snap, closer this time. Then came Greg's voice, drifting through the pines like a taunt. "You think you're hunting me, Laura, but I'm the one hunting you." Laura stepped outside, her eyes sweeping the dense undergrowth. The sunlight broke in thin shafts through the branches, painting everything in shifting light and shadow. It was the perfect place for someone to vanish or strike. Tim gestured toward the slope behind the cabin. Movement about 40 yards out. Laura motioned for 2 deputies to flank wide. But before they could move, a sudden whoosh cut through the air. Something metallic slammed into the side of the cabin with a hollow clang. A hunting arrow, its tip embedded deep in the wood. "Down!" Laura shouted, pulling Marcy, who had been in the SUV nearby for a location check, to the ground. She hadn't expected Greg to be armed with a bow, but it made sense. Quiet, deadly, perfect for the woods. A second arrow sliced past Tim's head, thudding into the dirt. The team scrambled for cover. And then silence. When they dared to look, Greg was gone again. That night back at the station, the weight of the case crashed down on Laura. She was exhausted. The team was stretched thin, and Greg was always one step ahead. The discovery of Amber Hollis's belongings haunted her, proof that there were victims they might never find alive. She replayed Greg's words in her head. "I'm the one hunting you." It felt true. Every move she made, he countered. Every time they closed in, he slipped away. And now, with Amber's case pulling in state police, the investigation had more eyes and more pressure than ever. Tim tried to keep her spirits up. "We'll get him. We just need the right break." But Laura shook her head. "We've had breaks, Tim. He's still out there, and he's escalating." She didn't say the rest out loud. If they didn't stop him soon, someone else was going to die. 2 days later, that fear nearly came true. A call came in from a hiker who had been chased out of forest by a man with wild eyes carrying a knife. When deputies searched the area, they found signs of a new camp and a trail of footprints leading back toward town. One set was Greg's. The other was barefoot, smaller and fresh. Laura's chest tightened. He had another woman. And this time, the tracks led straight toward Pine Mesa. As the team prepared to move, Laura's radio crackled. A frantic voice came through, a dispatcher. "Sheriff's unit, be advised. 911 call from a woman claiming to be locked in a basement. Address matches a vacant house on the edge of town." Laura's blood went cold. Greg had brought the nightmare back to where it began. And if she was right, they were running out of time. The vacant house sat on the edge of Pine Mesa like a shadow from another life. Peeling paint bordered windows and a yard choked with weeds. Laura's SUV rolled to a stop a block away. She and Tim slipped out, the tactical team fanning around them. Through her earpiece, Laura heard the dispatcher replay the 911 call. The woman's voice was shaky, desperate. "He's gone for now, but he said he's coming back. Please hurry." Laura's stomach twisted. They approached in silence, the only sound the crunch of gravel under boots. The late afternoon sun threw long shadows across the front porch, making the place look like it was holding its breath. Tim positioned himself at the back door with 2 deputies. Laura took the front with another pair. She tested the handle. Locked. She nodded to the breacher, who swung the ram. The door flew open with a hollow crack. The air inside was thick, stale. The faint smell of mildew mixed with something metallic, the same scent you remember from Marcy's basement. They moved room to room, clearing the kitchen, the living room. In the hallway, Laura spotted a door with a heavy padlock, but this one was bolted from the outside. "Here," she whispered. The breacher made quick work of it. Laura pulled the door open, revealing steep wooden steps descending into darkness. A dim voice floated up. "Hello." Laura's chest tightened. "This is Sheriff's office. We're here to get you out." She descended, flashlight cutting through the gloom. A young woman sat against the far wall, ankles shackled, wrists raw. She flinched at the light. "You're safe now," Laura said, kneeling to unlock the cuffs. But before she could finish, her radio hissed with Tim's voice, urgent and low. "He's here, back of the property, armed." The tactical team shifted instantly, half securing the victim, half moving toward the backyard. Laura bolted up the steps, her pulse pounding in her ears. Through the broken back fence, she caught sight of Greg, moving fast toward the tree line, a pistol in one hand, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. "Greg, drop it," she shouted, raising her weapon. He glanced back, grinning. "Not today." Then he ducked into the trees. Laura didn't wait. She sprinted after him, Tim close behind. Branches whipped against her arms as they crashed through undergrowth, the scent of pine and dust filling her lungs. She could hear him ahead, the snap of twigs under his boots. He wasn't running blindly. He knew exactly where he was going. And then it clicked. "The cabin!" Laura gasped to Tim. "He's making for the cabin. If Greg reached it, he could hole up for days, maybe longer. Worse, he might have more supplies and weapons stashed there. They had one chance to cut him off. By the time they reached the ridge overlooking the cabin clearing, Greg was already there, yanking open the door. Laura signaled for the team, the fan out. She could see him inside, tossing items into the duffel. He was frantic now, pacing like a caged animal. She met Tim's eyes and whispered, "We end this here." But before they could move in, Greg stepped back into the doorway and lifted something in his left hand. Not a gun, a long length of heavy chain. He was smiling. Greg's smile was the kind that made Laura's skin crawl. Not the grin of a man who thought he might win, but the smirk of someone who wanted to hurt before he lost. "Come on out, Laura," he called, swinging the chain lazily. "You've been chasing me for weeks. Don't you want to see how this ends?" Laura kept low behind a pine trunk, her weapon steady, her breath measured. "It ends with you in cuffs, Greg. drop the chain, and step away from the door. He laughed, a harsh, joyless sound. You really think you're taking me alive? I've done too much for that. Tim and two deputies moved quietly through the brush to flank the cabin. Laura caught Tim's signal out of the corner of her eye. They had a clean angle. All they needed was a distraction. She stepped from behind the tree, weapon still trained on Greg. You think you're in control, but the truth is, we've already got your girls. Marcy's safe. Sadie's safe. Even the one you had in that house. She's gone. You got nothing left. His expression faltered just for a second, but it was enough. The chain slipped in his hand as his eyes darted toward the tree line. Now! Laura shouted. Tim and the deputies burst from cover, weapons drawn. Greg spun, reaching for the pistol tucked into his waistband. Laura fired first. The shot struck his hand, sending the gun clattering across the porch. He roared in pain, stumbling back against the cabin wall. Tim was on him in an instant, tackling him hard to the ground. Greg fought, wild, desperate. But the deputies overpowered him, wrenching his arm behind his back and locking the cuffs with a metallic snap. It's over, Laura said, her voice low but firm. Greg glared up at her, breathing hard. You think this stops with me, he rasped. You have no idea. Laura didn't flinch. We'll find out, and you'll spend the rest of your life telling us. The trial was swift. The prosecution brought Marcy, Sadie, and the third rescued woman to testify, their voices shaking but resolute. Forensics linked Greg to the disappearance of Amber Lee Hollis, and though Amber's body was never recovered, the evidence of his pattern was overwhelming. The jury found him guilty on all counts: kidnapping, assault, attempted murder, and he was sentenced to life without parole. Marcy sat in the front row every day of the trial. She never looked away from Greg, not even when the verdict was read. Afterward, she told Laura, I needed to see him hear the word guilty. I needed him to know I'm not afraid anymore. Months later, Laura drove out to the edge of Pine Mesa. The house where Marcy had been kept was still vacant, the basement door hanging open, padlock long gone. She stood there for a long time, breathing in the desert air, thinking of all the women who had walked out of places like this, and the ones who never did. Greg's words sometimes came back to her. You have no idea. But she did. She knew exactly what monsters like him were capable of, and she knew she'd be ready for the next one. Because for Marcy, for Sadie, for Amber, and for every victim whose voice had been silenced, quitting was never an option.